On the morning of July 25, 1947, a young Army corporal named Elmer Douglas Whitfield reported for duty at the base hospital at Roswell Army Air Field the way he had every day for the past 11 months, carrying a clipboard, a fountain pen that leaked slightly at the nib, and no idea that before the day was finished, he would sign his name to 3 documents that no institution has ever admitted exist. Whitfield was 23 years old, a medical records technician assigned to the hospital's administrative wing, the kind of posting the Army gave to a man who could type quickly and follow instructions without asking questions he had not been invited to ask. His granddaughter, a woman named Carol Whitfield Ames, still keeps a photograph taken of him that spring, standing outside the hospital in his uniform, squinting into New Mexico sun, looking like exactly what he was, an ordinary clerk in an ordinary posting 2 years after the war had ended. What happened to him that July morning, according to the account his family has now chosen to make public, appears in no personnel file the Air Force has released, and in no surviving hospital log. It exists only in a single carbon duplicate, folded into eighths, that Elmer Whitfield kept hidden inside the lining of a tool case for 51 years, and that his family did not find until after his death. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Whitfield's own account, dictated to his son Richard in 1996, 2 years before his death, describes a knock at his barracks door sometime after 10 in the evening on July 24th. A sergeant he did not recognize told him to report to the hospital's rear entrance, the one used for supply deliveries rather than patients, and to bring his forms. Whitfield asked which forms. The sergeant said he would know when he got there. He describes walking across a base that felt, in his own words, wrong for the hour. Too many trucks moving with their headlights switched off, too many men standing in doorways who had no ordinary reason to be standing there, a quiet that he says did not feel like sleep, but like people holding still on purpose. He remembers the gravel under his boots and a light wind carrying dust off the flight line, details he includes not because they matter to the story, but because, his son says, that was the kind of man his father was. He noticed the ordinary things even while the extraordinary thing was happening to him. At the rear entrance, an officer he never learned the name of and never saw again led him into a room that had been stripped of its usual furniture and fitted instead with 3 examination tables, each occupied, each covered by a canvas sheet, pinned rather than draped, as though someone had wanted the covering to stay exactly in place, regardless of who moved through the room. The air, he told his son, carried a smell he spent the rest of his life failing to describe to anyone's satisfaction, something between ozone and whetstone, sharp enough that he noticed it before he noticed anything else. He was handed 3 blank standard form death certificates, the same forms he processed routinely for base personnel who died of illness or accident, and told to prepare them for signature. He asked what the cause of death should read. The officer told him to leave that field blank, that it would be completed later by someone with the authority to complete it. He asked for the names of the deceased. He was told there were no names. He asked, because he was a careful man and the forms required it, what he should write in the space reserved for a name, and the officer told him to write unidentified 3 times, once on each form, and to make sure his handwriting stayed legible, because the forms would be photographed before they left the room. It is at this point in his account that Whitfield describes lifting the corner of the first canvas sheet, not because he was told to, but because a man cannot fill out paperwork for what he cannot see, and needed, in some basic clerical sense, to confirm that a body was actually beneath it. What he says he found does not match anything he had processed in 11 months of hospital administration, and does not match, according to his son, anything he had prepared himself to see in advance. The being was small, he says, no more than 4 feet in length, with skin that had gone from whatever color it had carried in life to a gray closer to wet ash, and a head disproportionately large for its narrow shoulders. He counted 4 fingers on each hand rather than 5, and noted, because he was trained to note physical detail on intake forms even when he had no framework for what he was looking at, that the fingers were long and tapered and ended without visible nails. The eyes were closed. He was grateful for that, he told his son, more grateful than he could ever fully explain, then or later. He did not lift the other two sheets. He says he did not need to. Whatever certainty had settled into him after the first one was enough. What a camera would find, if it could be carried back to that room on that specific night, is a space lit by a single hooded lamp positioned to keep most of the walls in shadow. 3 canvas-covered forms arranged with a precision that suggests measurement rather than haste, and a young man in an army uniform standing very still beside the nearest table with a fountain pen already uncapped in his hand, waiting to be told what to write. Whitfield's son describes his father, in the 1996 recording, pausing for nearly a full minute before he can describe lifting the sheet, the longest silence anywhere in the tape. He completed the paperwork exactly as instructed, in block letters, with the cause of death field left empty on all 3 forms, and he signed his name in the space marked Certifying Officer, a designation he did not hold, and that was never explained to him, because the officer standing behind him told him to sign there, and Elmer Whitfield, 23 years old, and a very long way from the argument he might have made in different circumstances, signed. He describes the officer collecting the 3 forms, checking each one against the light of a hooded lamp, and photographing them individually with a small camera before folding them into a leather case. He was told, before he left the room, that the forms did not exist, that the night did not exist, and that if he were asked about his whereabouts he should say he had been reviewing inventory. He was not asked whether he understood the instruction. It was assumed that he did. The officer himself appears in Whitfield's account only in fragments, a voice pitched low and even, a wedding band he noticed on the man's left hand and never stopped wondering about, a leather document case with a brass clasp that closed with a specific double click Whitfield says he can still hear when the memory surfaces unexpectedly, even 50 years later. He never saw rank insignia clearly enough to describe it with confidence, and he told his son that this detail bothered him longer than almost anything else about the night. A man with the authority to direct a death certificate for something with no name, standing close enough to touch, and still, in every detail that mattered, unidentifiable. The leather case has never surfaced in any archive the family or independent researchers have located. What the surviving carbon copy shows, and what his family has allowed to be photographed for the first time, is a Department of the Army form, standard issue, dated July 25, 1947, bearing the printed heading of Roswell Army Air Field's medical office, with the name field on each of the 3 forms reading only the word unidentified, the cause of death field left empty, and a signature in the certifying officer's block that a forensic document examiner hired by the family in 2019 confirmed, with what she described as a high degree of confidence, matches known exemplars of Elmer Whitfield's handwriting from the same year. There is no official record of these 3 death certificates ever being filed. There is no corresponding entry in the base hospital's mortality log for the month of July, a log that is otherwise complete and accounted for, showing 4 other deaths that month, each properly documented, each carrying a name, a cause, and a disposition of remains. 3 certificates exist. 3 bodies are described in careful clerical handwriting. Nothing in the official record acknowledges either. What happened to Whitfield after that night follows a pattern his family did not fully understand until they began comparing his account to others outside their own household. Within 72 hours, according to his personnel file, which the family obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request in 2014, he was transferred out of the hospital's administrative wing and reassigned to a supply depot on the far side of the base, a lateral move with no stated reason, processing inventory rather than patient records for the remainder of his enlistment. The transfer order itself survives in the released file. The justification line, which every transfer order from that period was required to carry, is blank, a single empty rectangle on an otherwise fully completed form. His son remembers his father as a man who would not enter a hospital for any reason for the rest of his life, who delivered his own children by driving his wife to the entrance and then waiting outside in the parking lot for hours rather than stepping through the doors himself, and who, when finally admitted to a hospital in the final weeks of his own life in 1998, asked the nursing staff 3 separate times whether the room he had been given had a door leading to a rear loading area. He never explained why he asked. His daughter-in-law wrote the question down anyway, because by then the family had learned to write things down. A retired base historian who reviewed the released personnel file at the family's request in 2017 described the blank justification line as structurally unusual, noting that transfer orders from the hospital's administrative wing during that period were otherwise fully documented, down to the initials of the clerk who typed them. She found only one other comparably blank order in the surrounding 18 months of released records, and it belonged to a man whose file was otherwise sealed in its entirety. He spoke of the night only once beyond the recorded account, in a conversation his daughter overheard in 1981 and later wrote about in a private journal the family has since made public. He told her, she recalls, that signing his name to those forms was the only act of his entire life he could never take back, and that he had spent 50 years wondering exactly whose authority he had been borrowing when he wrote it. 2 men in civilian suits visited him at his home in Roswell in the autumn of 1953, 6 years after the incident, according to a note his wife kept in a household ledger she used to record visitors and expenses alongside grocery totals and utility payments. The entry reads only, 2 men, wed, Eve, E, upset after. No further detail survives beside it. His wife never told her children what the visit concerned. She died in 2001 without elaborating, and the ledger, with its single terse line sitting between a payment for coal and a payment for shoes, is the only surviving record that the visit ever occurred at all. It took Carol Whitfield Ames almost 4 years to move from the moment she found the folded carbon copy to the point of speaking with a document examiner, a base historian, and eventually the 2 other families whose accounts now sit beside her grandfather's. She has said the hardest part was never the document itself, but the ordinariness of the man who signed it. A grandfather she remembers teaching her to change a tire, not a man she associated with sealed rooms or unnamed officers. She does not need anyone to believe the account in order to feel its weight. She needs only for the paperwork to be looked at honestly, on its own terms. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Elmer Whitfield's account does not exist in isolation, and it is this fact, more than the carbon copy itself, that gives the story its weight. 2 other accounts, drawn from separate families with no known connection to the Whitfields and no known contact with one another across the following 7 decades, describe overlapping fragments of the same several hours inside the same building. A base security guard, whose family came forward separately and whose account now sits alongside Whitfield's in the small archive researchers have begun assembling, has described standing watch outside a partitioned section of the hospital that same night and seeing, through a gap in the canvas, one of the coverings shift, in his words, as though something beneath it retained some capacity for movement, even at rest. That observation cost him his post within a week and earned him a reassignment 3 states away, with a transfer order carrying the same empty justification line found in Whitfield's file. He described the shapes under the canvas as small, grey, and disproportionately headed for their build, a description he gave decades later to a family member who had never heard Whitfield's account and had no way of knowing the 2 descriptions would ever be compared. He also described the same smell Whitfield had described, the ozone and whetstone pairing that appears nowhere in any period training manual on chemical exposure or refrigeration, and that neither man had any evident source for beyond having stood, on the same night, in the same building. His family did not learn of Whitfield's account until a researcher connected the 2 personnel files by their matching transfer dates, 71 years after either man had left Roswell for good. A licensed nurse on duty at the same hospital during the same week has described being summoned to the partition section and told, without explanation, that her assistance would not be required after all, then escorted out through a corridor she had never used before, close enough to hear voices through a canvas wall, but not close enough to make out words. She recalled, in an account her granddaughter transcribed from a cassette recording made in the 1990s, a smell she could not place, something between ozone and wet stone, the same unusual pairing of terms Whitfield used independently in his own account 30 years before either family had any reason to compare notes. She also recalled, without prompting, that the officer who turned her away wore a wedding band on his left hand and spoke in a voice she described as low and even, a detail that matches, word for word, the description Whitfield gave his son of the man who stood behind him with the leather case. Neither family has been able to determine whether the two witnesses ever encountered the same individual officer or two different men trained to the same procedure. None of these three witnesses, so far as their families have been able to determine, ever spoke to one another about that night, not during their remaining decades of living in overlapping corners of the same small stretch of New Mexico, and not at the base reunions that some of them attended in later life, without apparently ever raising the subject. What is consistent across all three accounts is not simply the presence of something extraordinary in that hospital during the final week of July 1947, but the specific texture of the institutional response that followed each witness individually. A transfer within days rather than weeks, a justification line left conspicuously blank on paperwork that otherwise required one, a visit years later from men whose names were never recorded in any household ledger or personnel file, and a silence that each person carried alone rather than shared, even with one another, even when their lives crossed again in the decades that followed. This is the detail that makes the pattern difficult to set aside, as three unrelated people independently imagining the same handful of hours. The isolation itself was maintained with a consistency that outlasted the war, outlasted the base's own eventual redesignation as Walker Air Force Base, and outlasted the deaths of nearly everyone who might once have been positioned to give the order that produced it. Whoever separated Whitfield from the guard, and the guard from the nurse, and all three of them from any shared understanding of what they had individually witnessed, did so with enough precision that none of them, across 50 years of living in the same small radius, ever laid their fragments beside one another. It took their grandchildren, sorting through inherited boxes and cassette tapes 7 decades later, to notice that 3 separate households were quietly holding pieces of the same room. The researcher who first connected Whitfield's transfer date to the guards, a retired schoolteacher from Artesia with no formal training beyond an interest in local base history, has said that the moment she laid the 2 personnel files side by side on a kitchen table in 2020 and saw the same week, the same empty justification line, the same pattern of a man moved sideways and told nothing, she understood she was not looking at coincidence, she was looking at a procedure. A procedure does not require malice to be effective. It requires only that the people carrying it out know exactly what an empty line should look like and know how to produce 3 separate times, on 3 separate forms, for 3 separate lives, that the institution had already decided would never officially end. If the 3 accounts are read together, and read as records rather than stories, they require something specific of the official history of that week in July, something narrower and more uncomfortable than the general claim that a craft came down outside Roswell. They require that the base hospital, a building with a complete and internally consistent mortality log for every other week of that year, processed 3 deaths off the books, using a clerk with no medical authority, a nurse turned away without cause, and a guard reassigned within days for describing movement where there should have been none. They require that the paperwork trail be read not as absence of evidence, but as evidence of a specific kind of absence, engineered by people competent enough to leave almost nothing behind except 3 names, one word repeated, and a blank line where a reason should have been. The carbon copy itself now sits in a safe deposit box in Albuquerque, available to researchers by request through the family, alongside the document examiner's report and copies of the guards' and the nurses' family recordings. No federal agency has requested to examine any of it. What the Whitfield family is left holding, in the end, is a single sheet of carbon paper, folded into eighths for half a century, describing 3 deaths that no agency has ever listed, signed by a 23-year-old Clerk who spent the remainder of his life unable to walk through a hospital door without asking about the room behind it. The document does not prove what was under that canvas. It proves that someone, on a specific night in July of 1947, believed 3 bodies required a signature, that the signature required a name that did not exist, and that the young man who supplied one needed, from that point forward, to be moved somewhere he could be quietly watched and quietly forgotten in the same gesture. If the account is read as what it presents itself as, a record rather than a story, then somewhere in a filing system that has never been opened to the public, 3 certificates exist for 3 deaths that officially never happened, each carrying the same word, unidentified, written 3 times in the same steady, careful hand, by a man who spent the rest of his life waiting for someone to ask him about the room behind that door. He never got the question he was waiting for. He got a supply depot, a transfer order with an empty line where the reason should have been 2 men at his door 6 years later whose names his wife never learned or never wrote down, and 51 years of a folded carbon copy hidden in the lining of a tool case, carried from house to house, from decade to decade, until a man who had spent his whole adult life afraid of hospital corridors died inside one anyway, still asking 3 separate times about a door. Carol Whitfield Ames says she does not think of her grandfather as a man who kept a secret. She thinks of him as a man who was handed one, at 10 o'clock on a July night, by people who never gave him the chance to say no, and who then spent the rest of his life deciding, alone, how much of it he could carry without setting it down where someone else might have to pick it up. He chose, in the end, to leave it folded in the lining of a tool case rather than burn it, a decision his family has come to read as its own kind of testimony. A man who wanted the truth to disappear could have made it disappear at any point across 51 years. He kept it, instead, close enough to find, far enough to keep quiet, as though some part of him always intended for someone, eventually, to open that lining and ask him, too late to answer, what exactly he had signed his name to that night, and why. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.